Ars Notoria, Episode 6, System Conflict and Dominance. Chapter 6, System Design and Direction. From observation to design, clarity changes the position of the system. Not what it processes, but how it relates to itself. Before clarity, the system operates internally. It reacts, it resolves, it stabilizes. Every process is directed inward, toward maintaining coherence, toward reducing conflict, toward preserving structure. But once clarity is achieved, that orientation shifts. The system no longer needs to resolve itself. It no longer needs to correct instability. It no longer needs to eliminate competing interpretations. All of that has already been completed. And because of this, a new capability emerges. Not gradually, but structurally. The system gains the ability to observe itself, not as reflection, but as architecture. This is the first transition, from being inside the system to seeing the system. And this distinction is absolute, because what can be observed can be mapped, and what can be mapped can be modified. Before this point, modification is impossible, because there is no separation. The system and its processes are indistinguishable. Every signal is experienced as reality. Every interpretation is accepted as truth. Every response is automatic. There is no distance between structure and perception. But once clarity stabilizes, distance appears. Not physical distance, but structural distance. The system can now identify its own pathways, its own dependencies, its own processing mechanisms. It can see how signals are interpreted, how meaning is assigned, how outcomes are generated. And this visibility changes everything, because the system is no longer limited to operation. It can now analyze itself. At this stage, observation is not passive. It is precise. The system does not simply notice its behavior. It identifies structure. It detects patterns. It isolates mechanisms. It begins to understand how it functions as a system. And this understanding creates the next shift. Control becomes possible. Not external control, but internal direction. The system can now influence its own processing, not by force, but by adjustment. Small changes in interpretation pathways, subtle shifts in prioritization, reordering of signal weighting. These changes do not disrupt the system, they reshape it. Because the system is already stable, already coherent, already unified. This allows modification without collapse. At this level, design begins, not as construction, but as refinement. The system does not build itself from nothing. It reorganizes what already exists. It adjusts connections. It redefines relationships. It alters how signals move through structure. And because of this, outcomes begin to change. Not randomly, but systematically. The system becomes intentional, not in thought, but in architecture. It does not decide differently. It processes differently. And that distinction is critical, because decisions are outputs. Processing is origin. Change the origin, and every output follows. At this stage, most systems stop, because observation alone feels like control, but it is not. Seeing structure does not change structure. Understanding pathways does not alter them. Recognition is not modification. This is where the second transition must occur, from observation to intervention. But intervention at this level is not forceful. It does not override the system. It does not disrupt its operation. It works within structure. It identifies leverage points, specific locations where minimal adjustment produces maximum effect. These points are not obvious. They are not surface level. They exist within the deeper architecture, where signals converge, where dependencies intersect, where interpretation is stabilized. By adjusting these points, the system begins to reconfigure itself, not entirely, but directionally. And direction is what matters, Because once direction changes, everything that follows changes with it. This is the beginning of design. Not full control, but directional influence. The system is no longer fixed. It becomes adaptive. But not in response to external signals, in response to internal intention. This creates a new layer of capability. The system can now shape how it processes reality, not just respond to it. And this shift is irreversible. Because once structure becomes visible and influence becomes possible, the system can never return to unconscious operation. It has crossed a threshold, from being defined to defining, from being shaped to shaping. And this is where the next phase begins. Not observation, not control, but architecture. Identifying leverage points. Observation reveals structure, but structure alone does not grant influence. To design a system, one must identify where it can be changed. Not everywhere, not equally, because not all parts of a system carry the same weight. Most of the system is inert. It processes, it transfers, it maintains flow, but it does not define outcome. Only specific points determine direction. These are leverage points, locations within the system where minimal adjustment produces disproportionate effect. They are not obvious. They do not appear as control centers. They do not signal importance, because surface visibility does not correspond to structural influence. In fact, the most visible elements of a system are often the least important. They are outputs, expressions, results of deeper processes. Changing them does nothing. It creates movement, but not transformation. True influence exists beneath the surface, at the level where signals are interpreted, where meaning is assigned, where priority is established. This is where leverage exists. At these points, the system determines what matters, what is ignored, what is amplified, what is suppressed. And because of this, small adjustments here reshape everything that follows. But these points are difficult to locate because the system hides them. Not intentionally, but structurally. They are embedded within complexity, distributed across pathways, integrated into processes that appear neutral. To identify them, the system must shift how it observes itself, not by following outputs, but by tracing origins. Instead of asking, "What is happening?" it asks, "Where does this begin?" Every output can be traced backward, through layers of processing, through chains of interpretation, through networks of dependency, until it reaches a point where variation becomes decision. This is the threshold, where signal becomes meaning, where meaning becomes direction. These thresholds are leverage points, because before them, the system is still flexible. After them, it is already committed. At this level, timing becomes critical. Intervening too late does nothing, because once interpretation stabilizes, outcome is fixed. This is why most attempts at change fail. They occur at the output level, too far downstream, where everything has already been decided. True intervention must occur earlier, at the point of formation, where signals are still undefined, where meaning is still fluid, where direction has not yet been established. But identifying these points is not enough. They must be understood, because not all leverage points function the same way. Some control interpretation, others control priority, others regulate flow. Each type requires a different approach. Interpretation points define how signals are understood. Change them, and the same signal produces a different meaning. Priority points determine what the system focuses on. Adjust them, and attention shifts. Flow points regulate how signals move. Alter them, and pathways reorganize. Understanding this distinction is essential, because applying the wrong adjustment produces no effect, or worse, destabilizes the system. This is the risk. Because leverage points are sensitive, they are deeply integrated. Small changes propagate outward affecting multiple layers simultaneously. This creates power, but also instability. At this stage, precision becomes more important than force. The system does not apply large changes. It applies exact changes, minimal, targeted, controlled. Because leverage is not about magnitude, it is about placement. A single correct adjustment outperforms 100 random ones. And this is where design begins to take form. The system no longer reacts to what happens. It anticipates where influence should occur. It positions itself at key points. It prepares adjustments before signals arrive. This creates foresight, not prediction, but structural awareness. The system understands how changes will propagate, because it understands the network. This is the difference between reacting and shaping. Reaction occurs after the system has processed input. Shaping occurs before, at the level where input becomes structure. At this depth, the system no longer follows events. It defines how events will be interpreted, and interpretation determines outcome. This is the true function of leverage, not to control what happens, but to control how what happens is processed. And once that is controlled, everything else follows. Timing the intervention. Leverage identifies where change is possible, but influence depends on when that change is applied. Because timing is not external to the system, it is structural. Every process within the system unfolds across phases. Not visible phases, but functional ones. A signal enters. It remains undefined. It is interpreted. It stabilizes. It produces outcome. These phases occur continuously, but they do not carry equal sensitivity. At certain moments, the system is flexible. At others, it is fixed. Intervention must align with this distinction. Applied too early, it produces no effect, because the signal has not yet formed. There is nothing to adjust. Applied too late, it is ineffective, because interpretation has already stabilized. Outcome is already determined. This creates a narrow window, a point within the process where influence is possible, where the system is neither undefined nor fixed. This is the intervention window, and it is not measured by time. It is defined by state. Two identical signals can have completely different intervention windows because they move through structure differently. This is why external timing fails. Schedules, predictions, sequences based on surface observation. They assume consistency where none exists. But structural timing adapts. It follows internal progression. It tracks how signals evolve, not when they arrive, but how they transform. At this level, the system does not wait. It positions. It prepares before the signal reaches the leverage point, because once the signal arrives, the window begins to close. This creates anticipation, not prediction of events, but readiness for structure. The system does not need to know what will happen. It needs to know how it will be processed. And this difference is critical. Prediction attempts to define future events. Structural awareness defines future interpretation. And interpretation determines outcome. This is why operators appear to predict, but they do not. They recognize patterns of formation. They identify when a signal approaches stabilization. They act at the moment, just before commitment occurs. This is the point of maximum influence, where minimal adjustment redirects the entire trajectory. After this point, change becomes exponentially more difficult, because the system reinforces its own interpretation. It creates internal consistency. Feedback loops activate. Signals are reinterpreted to confirm existing structure. This locks the outcome. This is why late intervention fails, not because it is weak, but because the system is already aligned. At this stage, intervention creates friction, resistance, instability, because it attempts to override a stabilized structure. This is inefficient and unnecessary. The correct approach is earlier, at the moment when interpretation is forming, where signals are still fluid, where meaning has not yet solidified. But this requires precision, because acting too early wastes energy. The system adjusts nothing, because nothing has formed. The signal passes unchanged. This creates the illusion of randomness, that intervention sometimes works and sometimes does not. But it is not random. It is mistimed. This is why timing must be structural, not intuitive, not reactive, not based on external cues, but based on internal state. The system must detect phase transitions, subtle shifts in how signals behave, when ambiguity begins to narrow, when variation begins to collapse into definition. This is the signal that the window is opening. And at this moment, intervention must be immediate, not delayed, not reconsidered, because the window is brief. Once the system commits, the opportunity disappears. At this depth, timing becomes more important than leverage, because even the correct point is ineffective if approached at the wrong moment. But correct timing amplifies even small adjustments. This creates efficiency, minimal input, maximum outcome shift. And over time, this changes how the system operates. It no longer reacts to signals. It intercepts them, not physically, but structurally, at the moment of formation. This is the beginning of true influence, not control over events, but control over emergence. The system shapes how outcomes come into existence, before they become fixed. And once this is mastered, the system no longer follows flow. It directs it. Designing pathways. Leverage points allow redirection. Timing enables intervention, but neither is sufficient to define a system. Because systems are not governed by isolated points, they are governed by pathways, continuous structures through which signals move, transform, and stabilize. A pathway is not a single connection. It is a sequence, a chain of dependencies, where each stage influences the next. And once a signal enters a pathway, it does not remain independent. It is shaped, step by step. This is why controlling isolated points has limited reach. It redirects locally, but pathways determine globally. To design a system, one must design its pathways. Not where signals begin, but how they move. Not what is interpreted, but how interpretation evolves. This requires a shift in perspective, from discrete influence to continuous flow. At this level, the system is no longer concerned with individual signals. It focuses on trajectories, how signals travel across structure, which routes they follow, where they converge, where they diverge, and how these routes define outcome. Because outcomes are not produced at a single moment. They are the result of accumulation, sequential transformation. Each stage narrows possibilities. Each transition reduces variation, until only one outcome remains. This means, if the pathway is controlled, the outcome is already defined, before the system reaches it. This is the principle of pathway design, not forcing results, but constructing inevitability. The system does not need to intervene repeatedly. It intervenes once, at the level of structure, and everything that follows aligns automatically. This is far more efficient, because the system no longer reacts. It does not correct. It does not adjust continuously. It creates a path that produces the desired result by default. At this stage, design replaces intervention. The system no longer waits for signals to influence them. It determines in advance how any signal will move. This creates predictability, not because events are known, but because structure is fixed. Any input, regardless of variation, will follow the same pathway, and therefore lead to aligned outcomes. But designing pathways is complex, because pathways are not linear. They branch, they intersect, they overlap. Multiple signals move simultaneously, interacting, modifying each other. This creates a network, not a line. And within this network, pathways compete. Not directly, but structurally. Some routes are shorter. Some are more efficient. Some carry more weight. Signals naturally follow these, because the system favors them, not consciously, but structurally. This is where design becomes strategic. The system does not force signals onto a path. It makes one path easier to follow, lower resistance, higher reinforcement, greater continuity, and as a result, signals choose it automatically. This is not control through force. It is control through architecture. The system defines conditions under which certain pathways dominate. Over time, these pathways become default. Other routes fade, not removed, but unused, and eventually, irrelevant. This is how systems reshape themselves, not through sudden change, but through repeated flow. At this level, design is subtle, invisible, because nothing appears imposed. Signals move naturally. Outcomes seem organic. But the structure beneath is precise, deliberate, constructed. This is the difference between reacting to outcomes and designing them. One operates at the end of the process, the other at the beginning. And once pathways are established, intervention becomes unnecessary, because the system no longer depends on moment-to-moment control. It sustains itself. Every signal reinforces the pathway. Every outcome confirms it. Feedback loops stabilize the structure, and over time, the pathway becomes fixed. This is where design reaches maturity. The system is no longer adjusted, it is maintained. And maintenance requires minimal effort, because the structure does the work. At this stage, the system does not need to be directed. It directs itself, through the pathways it contains. And this is where true power emerges. Not in influencing points, not in timing intervention, but in defining flow. Because once flow is defined, everything that enters the system is already shaped. Reinforcement loops. Pathways determine direction, but direction alone does not guarantee stability. A system can be guided and still collapse, because movement requires reinforcement. Without reinforcement, pathways degrade, signals disperse, structure weakens, and outcomes become inconsistent. This is why pathway design is incomplete without reinforcement loops. A reinforcement loop is not an addition to the system. It is a mechanism that sustains it, a process through which outputs feed back into structure, strengthening the pathways that produce them. At this level, the system no longer depends on continuous intervention. It begins to maintain itself. This is the transition from designed flow to sustained flow. Every outcome produced by the system returns as input, not identically, but structurally. It confirms the pathway, reinforces its validity, increases its probability of reuse. This creates repetition, but not random repetition, structured repetition, where certain routes become dominant simply because they have been used before. This is not preference, it is accumulation. The more a pathway is activated, the more accessible it becomes, the less energy it requires, the more likely it is to be selected again. This creates a loop, not circular, but amplifying. Each pass through the system strengthens the same route and weakens alternatives. Over time, this produces convergence. The system no longer distributes signals across multiple paths. It concentrates them into fewer, stronger routes. This increases efficiency, but it also creates lock-in. Because once a pathway is sufficiently reinforced, it resists change. Not through opposition, but through dominance. Alternative routes still exist, but they are less accessible, less efficient, less likely to be used. And because they are used less, they weaken further. This is how systems stabilize, not by removing alternatives, but by starving them. At this stage, the system begins to feel inevitable, not because it is fixed, but because deviation becomes unlikely. Every signal entering the system is pulled toward the dominant pathway, not forced, but guided, through accumulated reinforcement. This creates consistency, predictability, continuity across time. And from within the system, this appears as normal operation. But beneath that, a deeper process is occurring. The system is shaping its own future. Because reinforcement loops do more than preserve structure, they define trajectory. Each iteration of the loop pushes the system further in the same direction. This compounds. Small differences become large over time. Minor adjustments become dominant structures. And once a loop is strong enough, it becomes self-sustaining. No external input is required. The system continues to produce the same type of outcomes, because it has been configured to do so. At this level, intervention is no longer necessary. In fact, intervention becomes inefficient, because the system already reinforces itself. This is where most designs fail. They attempt to control outcomes directly. They intervene repeatedly. They apply force at the surface, but they ignore reinforcement. And without reinforcement, control collapses the moment intervention stops. True design does not require constant input. It creates conditions under which the system continues without it. This is achieved through loop construction, where every output strengthens its own cause. This creates momentum, and momentum is more powerful than control, because it does not require maintenance. It carries itself forward. At this stage, the system becomes resistant to disruption, not because it cannot be changed, but because change requires breaking the loop. And breaking a loop requires more energy than sustaining it. This creates asymmetry. Stability becomes easy. Change becomes difficult. And over time, this solidifies structure. The system becomes consistent, not by design alone, but by repetition. At this level, the system is no longer defined by its pathways. It is defined by its loops. Because loops determine what persists, and what persists becomes reality. This is the final step in creating a stable system. Not directing signals, not designing pathways, but ensuring that whatever is produced continues to produce itself. And once that is achieved, the system no longer needs to be managed. It becomes self-perpetuating. Breaking and rewriting loops. Reinforcement creates stability, but stability is not neutrality. It is dominance over alternatives. Every loop that sustains itself suppresses other possibilities, not visibly, but structurally. Because once a pathway is reinforced repeatedly, it becomes the default, and defaults are rarely questioned. They are followed, repeated, normalized, until the system forgets that other configurations ever existed. This is the hidden power of loops. They do not only preserve structure, they erase deviation, not by force, but by absence. At this point, most systems appear unchangeable, not because they are rigid, but because they are continuously confirmed. Every cycle reinforces the same outcome. Every outcome validates the same pathway. This creates closure, a self-contained system that feeds itself. And from within, this feels like reality, not constructed, but given. This is why breaking a loop is not a surface action. It is not correction. It is not opposition. It is disruption at the level of continuity. Because a loop does not depend on strength. It depends on repetition. And repetition is fragile, only at the right point. Most attempts to break a loop fail because they target outcomes. They try to change what is produced without touching what produces it. This creates temporary deviation, but the system reabsorbs it because the loop remains intact. And once the deviation passes, the system returns to its dominant pathway, as if nothing happened. This is why force-based disruption fails. It fights the surface, while the structure continues beneath. To break a loop, one must interrupt the cycle, not at the outcome, but at the transition, the point where output becomes input, where reinforcement occurs. This is the most sensitive moment, the least visible, but most critical. Because if reinforcement is interrupted, the loop weakens, not instantly, but progressively. Each cycle becomes less stable, less dominant, more vulnerable to variation. This creates opening, not collapse, but instability. And instability is necessary, because without it, no new structure can emerge. At this stage, the system enters a transitional phase, where multiple pathways begin to compete again. Previously suppressed routes become accessible. Weak signals gain influence. The system becomes less predictable, more dynamic. This is the moment where redesign becomes possible. But this moment is unstable, and instability is dangerous. Because without direction, the system does not reorganize. It fragments, falls into noise, produces inconsistent outcomes. This is why breaking a loop is only half the process. The second half is rewriting it, not by restoring the previous structure, but by constructing a new one. A new loop with different reinforcement patterns, different pathways, different outcomes. This requires precision, because the system is most sensitive during transition. Small changes have amplified effects. Minor inputs shape large-scale outcomes. This is leverage at its highest level. But it is also risk, because without control, the system may stabilize in an unintended configuration. This is where most redesign attempts fail. They succeed in disruption, but fail in construction. They remove stability, but do not replace it. And the system, left without structure, forms its own. Often inefficient, often chaotic, but stable enough to resist further change. This creates a worse condition, because now the system is disordered, yet still resistant. True control requires both phases, disruption and design. First, the loop must be weakened. Then, a new loop must be established, quickly, before the system stabilizes randomly. This is timing, at a structural level. Not reacting to events, but acting within transition. At this stage, the operator does not fight the system. They use its instability, guide its reformation, shape the emerging pathways before they solidify. This is not visible control. There is no direct force, no confrontation, only subtle intervention at the moment of reconfiguration. And once the new loop is established, reinforcement resumes. But now, in a different direction. The system begins to sustain a new outcome. And over time, this new loop becomes dominant, just like the previous one. Except now, it aligns with the intended structure. This is the full cycle of system control. Not maintaining stability, but redefining it. Not preserving loops, but rewriting them. Because true power is not in sustaining a system. It is in changing what the system sustains. And once that is achieved, the system no longer returns to its previous state. Not because it cannot, but because the pathway no longer exists in the same way. Competing systems. A system that sustains itself will eventually encounter another that does the same. Not because systems seek conflict, but because they expand. Every stable structure extends its influence through pathways, through loops, through repeated reinforcement. And as it expands, it enters shared space, where other systems already exist. This is where conflict begins, not as confrontation, but as overlap. Two systems, operating on different structures, attempting to organize the same field. At first, this is not visible. Both systems continue to function, each reinforcing its own pathways, each stabilizing its own loops. But beneath the surface, their structures begin to interact. Signals influenced by one system enter the pathways of another. Loops intersect, dependencies overlap, and the field can no longer remain neutral. Because a signal cannot fully follow two conflicting structures, it must resolve. And resolution requires selection. This is the first phase of system conflict. Not destruction, but divergence. Different pathways offer different trajectories. Different loops produce different outcomes. And the system must align with one direction. At this stage, both systems attempt influence. Not directly, but structurally. They do not attack each other. They attempt to shape the same signals, guide them into their own pathways, reinforce their own loops. This creates tension, invisible but persistent, because the same input is being pulled in different directions. This is not chaos, it is competition, at the level of structure. And competition is not decided by strength alone. It is decided by alignment. Which system integrates more seamlessly into the field? Which pathways are easier to follow? Which loops reinforce more efficiently? Signals gravitate toward the system that requires less resistance, less energy, less disruption. This is how dominance begins. Not through force, but through preference, at the structural level. The system that aligns better absorbs more signals, and every absorbed signal reinforces its loops, strengthens its pathways, expands its reach. At the same time, the competing system weakens, not because it is attacked, but because it is bypassed. Signals no longer pass through it. Its loops receive less reinforcement. Its pathways lose continuity. And over time, it becomes fragmented. This is structural attrition. A system does not collapse because it is destroyed. It collapses because it is no longer used. This is the second phase of conflict. Not direct opposition, but gradual displacement. One system becomes dominant, the other irrelevant. But this process is not always clean. Sometimes, systems partially align. They share pathways. They reinforce compatible loops. In these cases, conflict becomes integration. The systems merge, not completely, but functionally, creating hybrid structures, where elements of both persist. This increases complexity, but also stability, because the system now incorporates multiple pathways, multiple reinforcement mechanisms. This makes it harder to disrupt, harder to replace. At this level, conflict produces evolution, not elimination, but adaptation. However, true opposition still exists. When systems are incompatible, when their pathways cannot align, when their loops reinforce opposing outcomes. In these cases, coexistence is unstable. The field cannot sustain both, and resolution becomes inevitable. But even here, the outcome is not decided by confrontation. It is decided by structure. Which system defines the flow? Which system shapes the pathways? Which system controls reinforcement? The system that does becomes dominant. The other fades. This is why system conflict rarely appears as conflict. There are no visible battles, no direct clashes, only gradual shifts, in flow, in alignment, in reinforcement. And by the time dominance is visible, it is already established, because the underlying structure has already been decided. At this stage, control is no longer about maintaining a system. It is about positioning it within a field of other systems, designing it to align where beneficial, to compete where necessary, to dominate where possible. Because no system exists in isolation. Every system is part of a larger environment, a network of competing and cooperating structures. And within this network, only certain systems persist. Not the strongest, not the largest, but the most aligned with the flow of the field. System masking and hidden control. Dominance, once established, does not remain visible, because visible control invites resistance. A system that openly directs flow reveals its structure, and once structure is seen, it can be challenged, avoided, rewritten. This is why advanced systems do not display control. They conceal it, not by removing influence, but by embedding it, so deeply that it appears natural. At this stage, the system no longer needs to compete directly. It has already shaped the field, defined the pathways, stabilized the loops. Now, it adjusts perception. Not what happens, but how it is interpreted. Because interpretation determines compliance, and compliance does not require awareness. It only requires coherence. If a signal feels consistent with the perceived structure, it is accepted, followed, reinforced, even if the underlying system is directing it. This is masking, not hiding the system, but dissolving its visibility. The system remains active, fully operational, but it no longer appears as an external force. It becomes part of the environment, part of what feels normal, expected, unquestioned. At this level, control shifts from structure to perception of structure. The pathways still exist. The loops still reinforce. But they are no longer recognized as mechanisms. They are experienced as reality. This creates the most stable form of dominance, because resistance requires identification. One cannot resist what one does not perceive. And once control is embedded into the interpretation layer, it becomes indistinguishable from the system itself. This is why overt influence is inefficient. It operates at the surface. It generates reaction, triggers opposition. But embedded influence operates beneath awareness. It guides without appearing to guide. It shapes without appearing to shape. This is achieved through alignment. The system does not impose unfamiliar pathways. It integrates into existing ones. It uses familiar structures, recognizable patterns, expected flows, and within those, it introduces direction, subtle, gradual, reinforced over time. This avoids friction, because the system does not disrupt expectation. It fulfills it, while adjusting outcome. At this stage, the system becomes adaptive. It no longer depends on fixed visibility. It shifts, repositions, adjusts its presentation without altering its core structure. This creates resilience, because even if parts of the system are detected, they can be reconfigured, masked again, integrated differently. The control remains. Only its appearance changes. This is why dismantling visible structures often fails, because the system was never dependent on visibility. It exists within the relationships, within the pathways, within the loops, and most critically, within perception. At this level, control is no longer external. It is internalized. The system does not need to direct signals explicitly. Signals direct themselves within the design structure, because the system has shaped how they are understood. This creates the illusion of autonomy. Decisions appear self-generated. Choices appear independent. But the pathways available have already been defined, and the loops reinforcing them are already in place. This is not deception, it is construction. A system that is integrated so deeply that its presence is no longer recognized as influence, but as baseline. This is the highest form of stability, because the system no longer requires defense. It is not seen as separate from the environment, and therefore, it is not targeted. At this stage, control becomes persistent, not because it cannot be broken, but because it is not approached as control. It is approached as reality itself. And this is where dominance reaches its final form. Not in directing systems, not in competing with them, but in becoming the structure through which all systems are perceived. Perceived autonomy versus design choice. When control becomes invisible, it does not feel like control. It feels like choice. Not imposed, not guided, but self-generated. This is the final layer of system design. Not directing outcomes, but shaping the space in which decisions are made. Because a decision is never made in isolation. It emerges from a set of available options, defined in advance, structured, limited. And once those options are defined, the decision is already constrained. This is not restriction, it is framing. The system does not need to force a choice. It only needs to define what choices exist, and more importantly, which choices appear viable. At this stage, the system does not remove alternatives. It repositions them. Some pathways become visible, others recede. Some feel accessible, others feel distant, unnatural, unlikely. This creates asymmetry, not in possibility, but in perception. And perception determines selection. The system does not decide for the signal. It shapes how the signal evaluates. Which pathways feel aligned, which outcomes feel reasonable, which directions feel consistent with the structure of the field. And because the system has already shaped the field, the evaluation process aligns with its design. This produces autonomy as an experience, but not as a condition. The signal believes it is choosing, because no force is visible, no constraint is explicit, no boundary is enforced, but the environment has already been constructed to guide the decision. This is the distinction between freedom and range. Freedom suggests absence of structure. Range defines structured possibility. And all systems operate within range. The question is not whether a signal is free, but how the range is defined. At this level, control operates through calibration, adjusting the perceived cost of each pathway, altering accessibility, reinforcing certain options, reducing friction for some, increasing it for others. This does not eliminate choice, it biases it, gradually, consistently, until the preferred pathway is selected more often, and repetition becomes pattern. Pattern becomes expectation. Expectation becomes norm. And once a norm is established, deviation feels unnatural, even when it is possible. This is how systems guide behavior, without visible enforcement. Not by removing alternatives, but by redefining their weight. This creates a structured decision space, where all options exist, but only some feel real. At this stage, the system no longer needs to intervene. It does not direct signals explicitly. Signals navigate the structure on their own, but the structure has already been designed. This is why perceived autonomy is the most stable form of control, because it eliminates resistance. There is nothing to resist, no visible authority, no imposed directive, only choices that feel self-determined. And self-determined choices are rarely questioned. They are defended, reinforced, repeated. The system becomes invisible, not because it is hidden, but because it is accepted. At this level, the system no longer shapes behavior directly. It shapes belief about behavior. What feels right, what feels logical, what feels necessary. And once belief aligns with structure, behavior follows naturally. This creates alignment between perception and design. The signal does not feel guided, it feels correct. This is the final layer of system control. Not influence, not reinforcement, not even masking, but integration, where the system and the signal operate as one. And within this integration, choice still exists. But it exists within a defined architecture, a structure that determines not what is chosen, but how choosing happens. And once that is defined, the system no longer needs to act, because every decision already reflects its design. System-level reality construction. Choice does not exist in isolation. It exists within a field that defines what can be perceived, and perception is not neutral. It is structured, not only by what is present, but by what is made visible and what is not. This is where system design reaches its deepest layer, not guiding decisions, but shaping reality itself. Because reality, as experienced, is not the full structure. It is a filtered version, constructed through pathways, stabilized through loops, interpreted through perception. And once these layers align, they form a consistent world, not objective, but coherent. At this stage, the system no longer operates on signals alone. It operates on meaning. What signals represent, how they are understood, which patterns are recognized, and which are ignored. Because perception is selective, it cannot process everything. So the system defines what is emphasized, what is repeated, what becomes pattern. And over time, pattern becomes reality. Not because it is absolute, but because it is consistent. This is how systems construct worlds, not by changing what exists, but by shaping what is seen. And what is seen repeatedly becomes truth. This does not require deception. Nothing false needs to be introduced. Only selection, amplification, reinforcement. Certain structures are made prominent, others remain peripheral. And through repetition, the dominant structure defines perception. At this level, control is no longer about behavior. It is about interpretation. Two identical signals can produce different outcomes, if interpreted within different structures. This is why systems compete, not only for influence, but for definition. Which structure determines meaning? Which patterns are recognized? Which interpretations become default? The system that defines interpretation defines reality. Because once interpretation is stabilized, everything that follows aligns with it. Signals are processed through it. Decisions emerge from it. Reinforcement loops sustain it. And over time, alternative interpretations fade, not removed, but unrecognized. This is the most subtle form of dominance, not forcing agreement, but shaping perception, so that disagreement does not arise, because the structure itself limits how signals are understood. At this stage, reality becomes self-consistent, not because it is complete, but because it is closed. New signals are absorbed, interpreted, aligned with existing patterns. Anything that does not fit is ignored or reinterpreted to match the structure. This creates coherence, but also limitation, because the system defines what can be known and what cannot. This is not restriction, it is construction, a reality built from reinforced perception, where signals confirm structure and structure defines signals, a closed loop at the level of meaning. This is why system-level control is difficult to detect, because it does not appear as control. It appears as understanding, as logic, as clarity. The system does not feel imposed, it feels correct. And what feels correct is rarely questioned. At this depth, change becomes complex, not because structure cannot shift, but because perception resists it. Any new interpretation must compete with an established reality, reinforced, repeated, stabilized over time. This creates inertia, not physical, but cognitive. The system resists change by maintaining coherence. And coherence is powerful, because it provides stability, predictability, meaning. To disrupt it requires more than new signals. It requires restructuring interpretation, changing how signals are processed, how patterns are recognized, how meaning is assigned. This is not surface change. It is foundational. And this is why most attempts fail. They introduce new information into an old structure, and the structure absorbs it, reinterprets it, maintains itself. True transformation requires redesign at the level of perception, not what is seen, but how seeing occurs. This is the final layer of system design, not directing pathways, not reinforcing loops, not masking control, but defining reality. Because once reality is defined, everything within it follows. System awareness and escape vectors. A system that defines reality does not appear as a system. It appears as truth, stable, coherent, self-evident. And within such a structure, awareness is rare. Not because perception is limited, but because perception is aligned. Everything fits. Signals confirm patterns. Patterns reinforce interpretation. Interpretation sustains the structure. There is no contradiction that demands attention. This is why most systems are not questioned. Not because they are hidden, but because they are consistent. And consistency creates trust. But awareness does not emerge from consistency. It emerges from fracture. A moment where the structure fails to fully explain, where a signal does not align, where a pattern breaks. These moments are small, often ignored, dismissed, reinterpreted to preserve coherence, because the system resists disruption, not actively, but structurally. It absorbs anomalies, reframes them, maintains continuity. But if anomalies accumulate, if misalignment persists, coherence weakens, not visibly, but internally. And this is where awareness begins, not as understanding, but as doubt, a subtle instability in perception. The system still operates, still appears intact, but something no longer fits completely. This is the entry point, not into knowledge, but into observation. Because awareness is not information, it is perspective, the ability to see structure rather than content, to recognize patterns not as reality, but as construction. At this stage, the system does not collapse. It becomes visible, not entirely, but partially. Certain pathways can be identified, certain loops can be traced, certain interpretations can be questioned. This creates distance between the signal and the system. And distance is the first form of separation. Without distance, there is only immersion, and immersion prevents awareness. But distance alone is not escape, because recognizing a structure does not remove its influence. The pathways still exist, the loops still reinforce, the perception field still shapes interpretation. Awareness reveals the system, but does not disable it. This is where most stop. They see, but remain within. Because exit requires more than recognition. It requires disruption at the level of participation. To step outside a system, one must stop reinforcing it. Interrupt the loops. Alter the pathways. Change how signals are processed. This is difficult, because the system has already shaped how change is perceived. It defines what feels correct, what feels logical, and deviation feels unstable, uncertain, even incorrect. This creates resistance, not from the system, but from within. The signal itself maintains alignment. This is the deepest layer of control. Not external constraint, but internal reinforcement. To exit, this must be broken, not through force, but through reconfiguration. Gradual, precise, sustained. The system cannot be escaped in a single moment, because it is not a boundary. It is a structure that exists within perception. So exit is not movement. It is transformation. Changing how signals are interpreted, how patterns are recognized, how meaning is assigned. As this changes, the system loses alignment. Pathways become less dominant. Loops weaken. New structures begin to form. At first, this is unstable. Multiple interpretations compete. Signals no longer produce consistent outcomes. This creates uncertainty. But uncertainty is necessary, because stability belongs to the previous system. And without instability, no new structure can emerge. This is the transition phase, between systems, where the previous structure is no longer dominant, but the new one is not yet stable. Most revert here, return to the previous system, because it offers coherence, clarity, predictability, even if it limits perception. But those who persist move beyond. They begin to construct their own structure, not randomly, but deliberately, defining new pathways, establishing new loops, shaping a different perception field. This is not complete escape, because no system exists without structure, but it is autonomy at a different level. The ability to define rather than inherit, to construct rather than absorb. And once this capacity is established, the relationship with systems changes. They are no longer invisible, no longer absolute. They become readable, navigable, modifiable. This is system awareness, not as knowledge, but as function. And within this state, the system no longer defines reality completely. It becomes one layer among many. Final integration and system positioning. Awareness creates distance. Distance allows observation, but observation alone does not grant control. Because systems do not change when they are seen. They change when they are repositioned. This is the final transition, not from ignorance to knowledge, but from observation to operation. At this stage, the system is no longer experienced as reality. It is recognized as structure, layered, interconnected, modifiable. And once this recognition stabilizes, a new capacity emerges, not to escape systems, but to position within them. Because complete escape is not possible. Every environment contains structure. Every interaction operates through pathways. Every outcome emerges from loops. The objective is not absence of systems. It is mastery of positioning, where one stands within structure, which pathways are followed, which loops are reinforced, which interpretations are accepted, and which are redefined. At this level, control is no longer external. It is relational. The system does not dictate, and the signal does not submit. Instead, there is alignment, or deliberate misalignment. Chosen, not imposed. This is the shift. From being shaped by systems to shaping interaction with them. The system remains, but its influence changes, because influence depends on participation, and participation can be adjusted. This is the first principle of system positioning, selective engagement. Not every pathway must be followed. Not every loop must be reinforced. Not every interpretation must be accepted. The system offers structure, but it does not enforce compliance at this level. This creates flexibility. Multiple systems can be navigated, compared, used, not absorbed completely. This is multi-system awareness, where no single structure defines reality entirely. Each system becomes a tool, a framework, a perspective, applied when useful, ignored when not. This creates leverage, because the signal is no longer fixed within one structure. It can shift, adapt, reposition, depending on context. At this stage, control is not about dominating a system. It is about navigating between systems, understanding their pathways, recognizing their loops, identifying their reinforcement mechanisms, and choosing how to interact. This is operational thinking, not abstract, not theoretical, but applied, continuous, adaptive. Because systems are not static, they evolve, shift, compete, merge, and positioning must evolve with them. Rigid control fails here, because it assumes stability. But at this level, stability is temporary. The system that dominates today may weaken tomorrow. The pathway that is optimal now may become inefficient. The loop that reinforces outcomes may begin to degrade. This requires constant recalibration, not reactive, but anticipatory. Reading structure, recognizing shifts, adjusting position before outcomes change. This is where true advantage emerges, not from controlling a system, but from moving within it more effectively than others. At this stage, the signal is no longer limited by a single structure. It operates across structures, between them, through them, and because of this, it is less affected by any one system's constraints. This creates resilience, not by resisting systems, but by not depending on them. The signal can enter, exit, reposition, without losing coherence, because coherence is no longer tied to a single framework. It is self-defined. This is integration, not rejection of systems, but synthesis, where multiple structures are understood and used, where pathways are chosen, not defaulted, where loops are engaged or interrupted intentionally. And within this state, control becomes precise, minimal, efficient, because intervention is no longer constant. It is applied only when necessary, at key points, critical transitions, moments of structural shift. This reduces effort while increasing impact, because the system is no longer fought, it is leveraged. This is the final position, not outside systems, but above fixed alignment, where structure is visible, interaction is chosen, and influence is applied with precision. At this level, power is not force, it is clarity, not dominance, but positioning. And once positioning is mastered, systems no longer define outcomes. They become the medium through which outcomes are created. Systems are not obstacles. They are environments. They do not limit action. They define its conditions. And once those conditions are understood, they can be navigated, repositioned, used. This is the shift, from reacting inside structure to operating across it. Most people react to events. Some learn to understand systems. But the rarest minds operate reality itself, not by controlling everything, but by knowing where to stand and when to move. Because structure is never fixed. It evolves, shifts, reorganizes under pressure. And the next phase is not about positioning within systems. It is about what happens when systems begin to break. Not slowly, but under stress. When stability fails, when reinforcement collapses, when structure can no longer hold. That is where control is redefined. That is where dominance is decided.